The rabbit weighed 19 pounds. Rose Calloway knew this because she had weighed him herself that morning on the kitchen scale twice because the first number had seemed unlikely. The second number confirmed the first. 19 pounds, 4 ounces, which was more than her neighbor's smallest dog and considerably more than anyone in Greene County, Missouri had ever seen a rabbit weigh. She set him back in his crate, a crate she had built herself from good oak, twice the size of any rabbit crate at the Rogersville market, because she had learned in March that standard rabbit crates were not built with Flemish Giants in mind, and loaded it into the back of the flatbed with the focused efficiency of a woman who has done a physical task enough times to stop thinking about it. The morning was cold and clear, October of 1933, and she had 2 more crates to load. The second rabbit was 18 pounds, steel gray like the first, with the same long-eared, wide-bodied presence that had been stopping people in their tracks since she'd brought the first breeding pair home from the estate sale in January. The third was a doe, slightly lighter, the same dense plush coat, the same quality of absolute untroubled composure that was the Flemish Giant's most disarming characteristic. They did not behave like prey animals. They sat in their crates with the settled authority of animals that had decided the world was generally acceptable and saw no reason to revise this assessment. Rose drove to Rogersville. She drove past the livestock barn where she usually sold because she was not going to the livestock barn today. She was going to the hotel. Her name was Rose Calloway. She was 27 years old and had been running the Calloway farm alone for 16 months. Since her father's stroke had left him at her aunt's house in Springfield and left her 65 acres of good Missouri bottomland, a hay operation, 12 standard Rex rabbits, and a feed bill that was eating her margin the way the river ate the South Bank every spring, steadily, without apology, and with a long-term intention that was not in her favor. She had been planning the Flemish Giants since September of the previous year. Not planning, reading, which led to corresponding, which led to a 6-month conversation by letter with a rabbit breeder in Pennsylvania named Edmund Voss, who had been raising Flemish Giants since 1908 and who had, in his 5th letter, said something she had written down and kept. The size of the animal determines everything. The feed cost is proportional. The meat yield is not. A standard Rex rabbit dressed out at 2 to 3 pounds. A Flemish Giant dressed at 5 to 8. The premium restaurant buyers in Springfield and Joplin, who had told her, through the hotel kitchen manager she'd been corresponding with since February, that they were paying 22 cents per pound for dressed rabbit. They were paying for weight, and weight was what the Flemish Giant had in extraordinary abundance. The fur was secondary but real. Edmund Voss had put her in touch with a felt manufacturer in St. Louis named Werner Koch, who had been trying to source large domestic rabbit pelts for 2 years. Standard rabbit pelts were small. Flemish Giant pelts were the largest domestic rabbit pelt available. Dense, uniform, more usable surface area than any competing breed. Werner Koch paid 40 cents per dried pelt. A Flemish Giant pelt was worth 4 times what a standard Rex pelt would bring. She had acquired the first breeding pair in January from the estate of a Belgian immigrant farmer in Stone County whose family had not known what the rabbits were worth and had sold them to Rose for $1.50 because she had arrived with cash, and the others who came to the sale had looked at the enormous gray animals and concluded that they were, for some unclear reason, not worth the trouble. She had driven home with 2 rabbits that together weighed 37 pounds, each of them occupying a crate built for an animal a third their size, each of them looking out at the passing Missouri countryside with the calm self-possession of animals for whom transport was simply the current chapter of an entirely manageable story. The first litter had arrived in March. Gestation in Flemish Giants ran 28 to 31 days, faster than any livestock animal she had managed, which was part of the economics she had explained to herself in September and had not stopped explaining since. 8 kits, 7 survived. By 12 weeks, all 7 were approaching 10 pounds, which was when she had taken the first 2 to the hotel kitchen manager in Rogersville, whose name was Gerald Firth, and who had looked at the dressed carcasses and then at the weight slip and then said, with the expression of a man revising a budget in real time, that he would take everything she could produce at 22 cents a pound. She had come back to the farm and bred the doe again that afternoon. The hotel loading dock was around the back, off the alley that ran behind the main street. Rose pulled the flatbed around and was climbing down to open the tailgate when she heard the truck slow on the alley behind her. She did not look up immediately. She was focused on the tailgate latch, which had been stiff since August. The truck stopped. A door opened and closed, footsteps on the gravel. She got the latch free and swung the tailgate down and turned to find a man standing at the back of her flatbed, looking at the 3 crates with an expression she recognized from every person who had seen her rabbits for the first time. Not quite disbelief, not quite alarm, but the specific recalibration of someone who has just encountered something their existing categories do not cover. He was 33 years old, chestnut-haired, the particular warm auburn brown that went darker in autumn light, and had never, evidently, been cut as short as it perhaps should have been. It curled slightly at the collar. He had hazel eyes, the kind that shifted between green and amber depending on the light, and in the alley light they were currently a warm amber that matched the October morning. A jaw that carried 2 days of stubble, the kind that was not neglect but constitution. He was lean through the shoulders, not broad the way some men were broad, taller, longer in the arm, the build of someone who moved well rather than someone who occupied space. He had the specific, disheveled competence of a man who was very good at several things and took none of them too seriously. He looked at the crate, at the 19-pound rabbit regarding him steadily through the oak slats. Back at the crate. He had the tone of a man checking an assumption. Those are rabbits. Rose looked at him. They are. His expression completed its journey from recalibration to genuine delight. Not the performed amusement of someone finding an oddity amusing, but the real kind that arrives before a person decides to allow it. How much do they weigh? The large one is 19 pounds. She began moving the first crate toward the edge of the tailgate. The others are 17 and 15. He stepped forward without being asked and took the far end of the first crate. He was strong enough that his half of the weight was handled without visible effort, which she noted and appreciated in the same moment. They carried it to the dock together, then the second, then the third. Gerald Firth appeared at the dock door and signed the delivery slip, and the exchange was complete in 10 minutes. And when she turned back from the dock, the man was still there, leaning against the alley wall with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at her in the specific way of someone who has decided to be present a little longer. Callum Hart. He put his hand out. I do grain and hay on the Hart farm, 2 miles north of you on the county road. Rose Calloway. She shook it. I know the farm. He looked at the empty flatbed. I've driven past your place every week for 8 months and I never once saw rabbits that size. You wouldn't have, she told him. The hutch is behind the barn. He absorbed this. He looked at her with the amber hazel eyes that had shifted slightly toward green in the changed light. He had the quality she would come to recognize in him, an unhurried interest, the kind that came from someone to whom patience was not an effort, but a natural condition. What do you do with them? He asked. Besides the hotel. She looked at him for a moment. She was not, as a rule, in the habit of explaining her business to strangers in alleys. But he had helped with the crates without being asked, and asked one good question, and was looking at her the way people look when they actually want to know the answer. Meat and fur, she told him. The pelts go to a felt manufacturer in St. Louis. The meat to Gerald Firth and 2 restaurants in Springfield once I'm at volume. He was quiet for a moment. The way she would learn meant processing, not distance, not disinterest, but the complete taking in of information before arriving anywhere with it. How long until you're at volume? Spring, she told him, if the next 2 litters come in like the first. He nodded once, unhurried. Then he looked at his own truck and back at her. He put his hat back on. It was good to meet you, Rose Calloway. He drove away. She stood in the alley for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then got in the flatbed and went home. He came by the farm the following Saturday, not to the gate, to the front door, hat in hand, which she opened before he knocked because she had heard the truck on the gravel. He wanted to see the rabbitry, he told her, if she didn't mind. She minded not at all. She took him around to the hutch behind the barn, which was not yet the proper rabbitry she was planning. That was a project for spring, when the income justified the materials. But the current arrangement, 12 hutches of stacked oak, each one housing an animal that made visitors visibly recalibrate. The does with their current litters, the buck in the end hutch looking out with the regal composure that large animals develop when they have never been threatened. He stood in front of the buck's hutch for a long moment. 21 pounds, she told him. He's the heaviest I've got. Callum looked at the animal, not with the comedy most people brought to it, but with genuine respect, the way you look at something that has earned its size. Callum looked at the doe at the far end, who was currently reorganizing her nesting material with a focused efficiency that was, Rose had always thought, one of the most purposeful things she had ever watched an animal do. What's the gestation? 28 to 31 days, she told him. I can run 5 litters a year from each doe if I manage the schedule right. He worked something out in his head, which she could see from the slight shift in his expression. Then he looked at her with the amber eyes. You'll outproduce every rabbit operation in the county before spring. I'll outproduce every rabbit operation in the state before spring, she told him, if everything goes as planned. He looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, the beginning of a smile that arrived before he decided to allow it, the same quality as the delight in the alley. He started coming on Saturdays. Before we find out what Rose builds from $1.50 and 2 rabbits nobody in Missouri had seen before, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This channel reaches people from all around the world, and we love knowing where these stories land. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. New stories every week. The proper rabbitry went up in February of 1934, 40 feet by 20, designed herself over 6 weeks with graph paper and Edmund Voss's recommendations. Ventilation planned to prevent respiratory problems. Hutches sized for animals approaching 4 feet stretched out. Feed room and processing area at the near end. Callum helped frame it over one weekend with his brother, which she acknowledged with a supper, and neither of them made more of it than that. By March, the rabbitry held 22 animals on a schedule she had worked out to the week. 3 does rotating through 4 litters each per year. Gestation tracked against the calendar with a precision Edmund Voss called the most organized operation he had heard of outside Pennsylvania. The county had its opinions. Sam Draper at the feed store said rabbits were a woman's hobby, not a farm operation. Clara Finch at the post office said nobody in Greene County ate rabbit. The county extension agent, Arthur Pell, came to the rabbitry in March and said, after 2 hours with the records and the animals, the carcass weight differential alone makes this the most efficient protein operation I've seen in this county. He mentioned it at the state conference in April. Werner Koch in St. Louis wrote in April with an expanded contract. A hat manufacturer in Chicago wanted a direct supply agreement. She wrote back that she could scale to 40 animals by fall. Gerald Firth at the Rogersville Hotel had already introduced her to his counterpart at the Springfield Hotel, who had signed his own agreement in March. 2 restaurants in Joplin were in correspondence. She was not yet at the volume all of them wanted, but she was going to be. Callum came on Saturdays, occasionally on Wednesdays, which she had begun to expect without examining the expectation. He fixed the ventilation gap on the north wall. He noticed before she did that the buck's water line was freezing overnight and rigged a solution from her barn materials on a Sunday, mentioning it only when she asked why the line was working. He never told her what to do. He came, he looked, he did the useful thing, and went back to his own farm. We're halfway through this story, and we want to know, have you ever seen a Flemish Giant rabbit in person? At 19 pounds, they stop everyone cold. Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your reminder. New stories every week. The Springfield hotel contract came through in May at 24 cents per pound. The Joplin restaurant followed in June. In July, Heinrich Bauer, a St. Louis hat manufacturer, came to the farm, spent 3 hours in the rabbitry examining pelts, and offered 48 cents per dried pelt, 8 cents above Werner Koch's price, minimum 60 per quarter. She wrote to accept the same evening. The combined income for 1934, meat sales and pelts, both income streams running from May through December, was $462. Against the $91 the Rex rabbit operation and the hay had cleared in the previous full year. She updated the ledger in the 2 colors she had been using since March, black for meat, blue for pelts, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. It was a Saturday. Callum was coming in the afternoon. She had known this since Wednesday, the way she had been knowing his Saturdays since October, with the particular knowledge that had stopped being a neutral fact sometime around February. She left the ledger open on the table. He arrived at 2. She met him at the door, and he came in and sat at the table and looked at the ledger without being invited to, because by this point the ledger was something they had looked at together enough times that no invitation was required. He looked at the annual total. He turned the page. He looked at the quarterly breakdown. He set the ledger down. Her name and his voice had acquired over 11 months a quality it had not had in the alley. A weight, a specificity, the way you say a word when you have been thinking about it for a long time. She waited. She was good at waiting. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since October, not at the rabbits, not at the ledger, and she had been receiving this look for 11 months with the patient attention she brought to everything that mattered and that she intended to keep. He said, "I have been watching you build something that nobody in this county understood while you were building it." She held his gaze. He held hers. He said, "I'd like to still be watching in 30 years. All of it." He paused. "You." She looked at his hands on the table, at the ledger between them, at a man who had helped her carry rabbit crates without being asked, and fixed her water line on a Sunday morning, and never once told her what the operation should be. She said, "You've been watching since October." He said, "I know. I was working up to the question." She almost smiled. "You asked good questions the whole time." He did smile. The full kind, the one that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth, the amber hazel warming to something that was entirely his own. "I was practicing," he told her. She had arrived at her answer in February, in the specific way she arrived at conclusions she trusted, through the accumulation of evidence, evaluated honestly. She had simply been waiting for him to arrive at his question. He did not propose at the kitchen table, though it would have been practical. He proposed in the rabbitry on a Tuesday morning in September, when she was processing the fall pelts and had rabbit fur on her hands and her forearms, and the bib of her apron, and he came in because the rabbitry door was open, and walked to where she was working and stood there for a moment, looking at her the way he had been looking at her for a year, and then he said it. Not elaborate, not arranged, just true and direct, and at the moment she was actually in, which was the thing about Callum Hart she had understood from the alley. He appeared where things were actually happening, and dealt with them as they were, not as they could be arranged to seem. She said yes without putting down the pelt she was holding, because it needed to dry flat, and the timing of his question did not change that. He laughed, the full kind, and she laughed too, and the 19-pound buck in the hutch behind them observed the entire scene with his characteristic equanimity, and then went back to his hay. They were married in November of 1934 in the Rogersville church. She wore a deep amber dress, the color of the autumn light that came through the rabbitry door on October mornings, because she was not a woman who felt she owed anyone ivory. Callum stood at the altar in his good jacket, and watched her walk toward him with the expression of a man who has been paying attention for 14 months, and finds the arrival of what he has been watching entirely equal to the watching. The county attended. Most of it had opinions about Rose Calloway's rabbits and wanted to see what came next. What came next was a wedding, followed by a reception at which Sam Draper at the feed store told Callum, with the specific candor of a man who has been wrong in public and knows it, that those were the finest-looking animals he'd ever seen in his life, which Rose heard from across the room and filed in the same ledger where she kept everything that was worth keeping. Their daughter Ada arrived in the summer of 1935, chestnut-haired like both parents, and deliberate in the way of children who have been paying attention since before they could speak. Their son William followed in 1937 with Callum's patience and Rose's precision in the same constitution. By 1936, the rabbitry held 47 animals. Pelt shipments to Heinrich Bauer ran above the contracted minimum every quarter. The meat contracts covered 4 hotels and 3 restaurants across southwestern Missouri. Edmund Voss mentioned her operation in a letter to the Pennsylvania Rabbit Breeders Association as the most productive Flemish Giant operation he had encountered outside the Northeast. In March of 1937, the Greene County Agricultural Extension invited her to speak at the Spring Farming Conference in Springfield. Not as a curiosity, as a model. 22 farmers in the room. She stood at the front with the ledger, 4 years of data in 2 colors, and explained it plainly from the beginning. The size differential, the carcass weight, the feed-to-yield ratio, the pelt income as a secondary stream that cost nothing beyond the meat operation, the gestation cycle, and what it meant for production planning. Callum sat in the back row. He had driven her to Springfield and carried the ledger from the truck and taken the last row because the front rows belonged to the farmers who needed them more. He was watching her with the expression she knew from the alley and the rabbitry and the kitchen table. The complete, unhurried attention of a man who has been watching something and has never once found it less interesting than the first time. She did not look at him during the presentation. She was presenting. But she knew he was there, the way you know the location of the fixed point when you are moving through unfamiliar country. When the questions were done and the farmers had shaken her hand, she picked up the ledger and walked to the back of the room. Callum took the ledger without being asked, held the door, walked beside her to the truck. They drove home through the March, Missouri countryside with the window cracked and the early spring smell coming in, neither of them saying much, the way you don't when something has gone exactly as it should. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the seat. She turned her hand over and held on. The rabbitry would have 48 animals by April. Ada was learning the feeding schedule. William was 18 months old and had already developed the habit of sitting beside the buck's hutch with an expression of grave mutual inquiry that Rose found privately very funny and entirely right. The ledger in the 2 colors sat in the back seat, telling the truth the way it always had. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. Leave a comment below. Has anyone ever explained something to you that made you see a whole situation differently? Your stories are what makes this community what it is. Subscribe if you haven't already. We'll have a new story for you next week. Rose Calloway had been told that rabbits were a hobby, that nobody in Greene County ate rabbit, that the restaurants were too far to matter. The county said these things with the confidence of people who have not done the arithmetic, which is a different kind of confidence from the kind that comes from doing it. She had done the arithmetic in September of 1932 and had not needed to redo it. The size determines everything. Edmund Voss had written that in his 5th letter, and she had understood it immediately. The way you understand a thing when you have been thinking about the problem from the right angle, and someone finally names what you've been seeing. A 19-pound rabbit dressed at 7 pounds of meat, at 22 cents a pound, 5 litters a year, 8 kits per litter. You do the arithmetic, and then you build the hutch big enough to hold the answer.